Entourage. So this is part of what I'm calling my television addiction series, in which I go through and talk about all the TV shows I watched in 2011 and 2012 when I was living in Cambodia and was watching way too much TV. For more information about what this series is and why I'm doing it, I made a video trying to explain it, which I'll link to in the description down below. But for today, Entourage. So Entourage is a famous enough show that I suspect most people watching this video are already familiar with the general premise. But just in case, for those of you who are not familiar, I'll try and recap it briefly. Entourage is apparently based on the Mark Wahlberg's early career, when Mark Wahlberg was a young up-and-coming Hollywood star, and he was being followed around in Hollywood by his crew of friends, which came over from Boston with him to LA. And there appeared to be conflicting reports about who first got the idea to make a TV show based off of Mark Wahlberg and his group of friends. Some people say Mark Wahlberg himself came up with the idea. Some say it was one of the members of the Entourage. Some say it was the various Hollywood people who just saw Mark Wahlberg's Entourage and thought they were a really funny group of guys who were up to a whole bunch of antics, and there was probably a TV show to be made about them. But regardless, apparently the general idea is that there's a young up-and-coming Hollywood star who is just on the verge of breakthrough success, and he's surrounded by a group of friends that he's brought over with him from the East Coast. They changed it in the TV show. Mark Wahlberg and his crew are from Boston. In the TV show Entourage, they're all from New York. But at any rate, from somewhere on the East Coast, and are having new adventures in Hollywood, and the show is all about their new adventures in Hollywood. I remember reading about the premise for this show, I don't know, somewhere on the internet or some newspaper somewhere, and thinking, okay, that could work or it could not, because you have an interesting, I mean, it's a show about a group of friends, which of course are a dime a dozen in sitcom land. But there's an interesting power dynamic, because only one of those groups of friends, only one person in that group is the leader, the guy who everything else revolves around, which has the potential to explore some interesting power dynamics, or has a potential to just be really boring, kind of one star and his group of yes men, I was thinking. I first started watching this show in Japan. I think the show came out in 2004. And I think I started watching it in Japan in about 2007. Now, in Japan, I was renting it at the DVD shop, at the DVD rental store. And not all American TV shows make it big in Japan, especially not comedies. Comedies have a harder problem jumping across the language barrier. They do, of course. You know, a show like Friends is tremendously popular internationally, but it's generally harder for comedies. So Entourage was one of the select few American comedy shows that was featured in the Japanese DVD rental shop that I was frequenting in 2007 and 2008. And I think I rented the first episode just on a whim. I worked my way through most of the other stuff in that DVD shop and thought, okay, well, I've heard about this show, something to do with Mark Wahlberg, blah, blah, blah. And I watched the first few episodes and almost immediately got hooked. I found it to be an incredibly addictive show. Meaning you can binge watch several episodes at once, and you don't seem to get tired of it. At least I didn't. It just seemed to keep pulling me around, watching more and more episodes. There's usually an overarching, sorry, not usually, there's always an overarching plot that will connect the seasons, usually based upon Vince trying to get a role in a new Hollywood movie, and the whole drama about whether or not he will land that role. But in between that overarching arc across the season, each episode will have like a little mini drama, usually based upon the antics of some of the people in the entourage or something like that. So it's a good mix of overarching plot mixed with satisfying payoffs for the whatever story is within the episode. The main character is Vince, who's the young up-and-coming Hollywood star, who's in many ways is the most boring character in the show, but he plays the part. He's young, he's handsome, he's charming. He does, I guess, everything you need to do for that role. His right-hand man is his childhood friend E, who is another straight man, very, very earnest. Again, is doing everything he needs to do in that role, but not particularly funny or interesting for comedic value. But the other two characters, who are in some ways kind of the side characters, but in many ways the stars of the show, are Turtle and Johnny Drama. So Turtle is the gopher of the group, apparently based off of one of Mark Wahlberg's gopher characters, who is a classic screw-up and completely over-arrogant and always screwing things up, and not a likable character per se, at least not from my perspective, but you don't need to like a character necessarily to enjoy watching them. And Turtle is very funny. I thought the story arcs around him were very funny, and there was always a certain amount of cringe of watching him think he was much better than he actually was, and then having everything he tried fall apart. And I quite enjoyed that. But the other character is even better, Johnny Drama, who is Vince's older brother, who at one time had some Hollywood success, but that's just washed away now. So he's just hanging on into Vince's entourage, but while still trying to maybe recapture some of his former glory days himself. Now, this was apparently based off of one of Mark Wahlberg's cousins, who Donnie Wahlberg had sent to keep an eye over him when Mark Wahlberg was first starting out in Hollywood. Donnie Wahlberg is Mark Wahlberg's older brother, who was... I say this because I'm sure a lot of people know, but maybe not everybody knows. He was in New Kids on the Block, which was absolutely huge when I was in 5th grade, that band. But then, you know, as these boy bands do, since faded into obscurity afterwards. Or not quite obscurity, they're still a recognizable name. Obscurity is the wrong word. But we're past their prime. It's kind of maybe, I don't know, a representation of Donnie Wahlberg, or kind of based on this character that Donnie Wahlberg sent to watch over Mark Wahlberg. It's also in an interesting kind of nod to real life. The character who plays him is Kevin Dillon, who is the older brother of the much more successful Matt Dillon. And Kevin Dillon had a few big roles in the 80s. He never became a breakout star, but he had a major role in Platoon. He played Bunny, the psycho character in Platoon. He was also was a starring role in the 1988 remake of The Blob, a film I've actually talked about on this YouTube channel. But then never really got a big break after that until Entourage. So it's interesting that there's some parallels between the actor and the character. But Johnny Drama was just absolutely my favorite on that show, because he had such a sense of his own self-importance, which was constantly at odds with his career trajectory. And it was a loyal big brother to his little brother Vince, but at the same time had ambitions of his own. And he had such, I said Turtle had an overinflated view of self-importance, but Johnny Drama had this overinflated view of self-importance times 10, despite the fact that he was only a member of the Entourage. And Kevin Dillon really played this character to perfection. The way Johnny Drama would just start everything he was saying with this bravado that he just thought everything he was saying was of such great importance, even though most of the time he was saying something absolutely ridiculous. It was just the perfect comedic character. And then, of course, there was Vincent's agent, Ari Gold, who was a completely obnoxious character, but played very well by the actor for what it was, and was fascinating to watch, even though he was a completely loathsome human being. So I watched the first 4 seasons in Japan, which was all the seasons that were available in the DVD shop at the time, the DVD rental place. Then lost track of the series for several years until back in Cambodia. Sorry, not back in Cambodia. In Cambodia. And had access to all these cheap DVDs at the various DVD stores in Cambodia. And picked off where I left off at season 5 and continued watching from there. And as I continued watching, I continued to find the show highly watchable, although more and more I would get to the end of the season and think to myself, okay, I guess it was watchable, but I'm not sure I'm glad I watched that. It felt more and more like a waste of time. Although, if you enjoy watching it, maybe that's enough. I mean, that's all really television is, isn't it? Just a distraction. As I started to read some reviews of the show, though, stuff on the AV Club and elsewhere, it seemed like a lot of people were of the opinion that the show had started out great in its first few seasons as a satire on Hollywood, with Vince and his crew being kind of outsiders looking in on the Hollywood elite. But people were of the opinion that the show had just gone on a few seasons too long. And then it more and more became not a satire of Hollywood, but just a representation of Hollywood where we were supposed to live vicariously through Vince and his crew. I've heard it described by a few different people now as Sex in the City for men. So now, I'm not really able to judge entirely how accurate this comparison is, because I have never seen a full episode of Sex in the City. I've seen some parts of it, but never watched any episode all the way through. But I think the idea is Sex in the City is supposed to be this fantasy world for women, about all these successful women living this luxurious lifestyle in New York, I think it is. Whereas Entourage is supposed to be this fantasy for men, where you watch these guys living the Hollywood dream, sleeping with all these beautiful girls, all these nice cars, etc. Which wasn't the way it was in the first few seasons, but is the way it's maybe evolved into the last few seasons. Certainly, I found that the later seasons were perfectly watchable, but they weren't, those early seasons. I remember in Japan watching those DVDs and not just watching them to kill time, although I was watching them to kill time, I guess, but it was one of those shows where the funny lines stuck with you a few days later, and I found myself, at bars talking to people about the show, and other people had been like, yes, I love that season, I love that character, and you could quote lines with different people at the bars. It was something that everybody was watching and everybody was enjoying, and everyone seemed to have all the quotable lines. And I think that was just much, much less in the later seasons. Certainly I felt like I watched those later seasons in isolation. I couldn't go to anyone at the bar and talk about the latest episode of Entourage like you could maybe in 2007 when that show was in earlier seasons and much more people were talking about it. And then a movie came out. I believe the movie came out in 2015, which was absolutely hated. And I've never seen the movie to this day, but I'll link to a funny review that Mark Kermode, the famous critic for the Guardian newspaper, did of the movie, where he was just livid about how awful the movie was and how awful the lifestyle of the characters were, and how the movie seemed to be endorsing the shallow, awful lifestyle of the characters. I've since heard differing views on the movie. Some people say people who've never seen the show seem to absolutely hate the movie. People who had seen the show are divided. Some people said by the end of the last season the show wasn't all that good anyways, and then the movie just followed that trend. Some people have maintained a fondness for the TV show all the way to the end, and those people seem to have liked the movie. But people who were not familiar with the show, like Mark Kermode, really hated the movie. I'll link to his review in the description down below. It's funny how angry he got about this movie. I've never seen the movie, so maybe he's right. Who knows? But I don't know. You know, all this negative backlash against the last few seasons of Entourage and against the movie caused me to think that maybe I was much too kind to it initially. Maybe the original seasons were never that great to begin with. Maybe I was just a shallow person who got swept up by a shallow TV show. But I really enjoyed the first few seasons of Entourage, for whatever that's worth.